This video is part 2 of an extended series. Link to the first part will be provided in the description below. No matter how much time I dedicate to media on paper, the most common way of consuming it is through animation. While we already have a huge essay on how dubbing worked back in the days, with little elaboration on how it was influenced by the economy at the time, I believe there is still an important aspect to discuss. Most modern anime fans in Poland are either very late millennials or zoomers. The reason for this is because the very early 2000s were the peak for imported animation. Starting around the time, animation was being dubbed in Polish with exceptional quality. Cartoon Network had some of its best shows during that era, and they were all dubbed wonderfully. You might recall shows such as Ed, Edd n Eddy, Foster's Home, The Powerpuff Girls, and Johnny Bravo becoming smash hits the same year they were brought to Poland. Anime also started being aired on mainstream channels during the weekends, and most of it was dubbed really well.
Zjadłbym 10 hamburgerów, a potem spałbym ze 14 godzin.
Cieszę się, że przyszłaś. Mam ci coś ważnego do powiedzenia.
Lepiej, żeby to było coś naprawdę ważnego, Silva.
So, why did it not catch on like a tube? Remember when I mentioned that the first animation studio in Poland was also known for cooperation with Hanna-Barbera? This is an important hint as to why anime is perceived the way it is. Hanna-Barbera was the animation studio that had control over more or less 90% of the animation market in the 70s, causing the first animation dark age. I'm mentioning this because Hanna-Barbera is also often accused of being the sole company responsible for degrading the medium of animation into what is essentially crap for kids. It is important to mention that the stigma has recently been somewhat lifted in the United States, where the medium has been constantly rediscovered, and even mainstream television animation has been getting increasingly experimental, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. However, this change never took place in Poland, where animation is still largely considered a medium for kids. Remember how I mentioned that animation in Poland has basically been divided into 3 categories, one of which was basically non-existent? It has to be clarified that over the years, there has been no in-between for cartoons for slightly older children or animation for adults that has some dignity. If a Polish channel imported, for example, Naruto and ordered quality translation and voice acting, they usually weren't doing it with the mindset of localizing an animated show for teenagers or young adults. The default thought process was that cartoons are for kids, anime qualifies as a cartoon, ergo it is okay to show violent shows to children. And if there is blood or foul language, just censor it in post-production. Yes, this has been the standard process of localizing anime in Poland for ages. Imagine if every anime brought over to Poland was given the 4 kids One Piece treatment.
But Paul, you said that shows like Ed, Edd n Eddy and Powerpuff Girls were smash hits. How can it be they weren't suitable for toddlers?
Because you're comparing apples to oranges to pineapples. It is easier for an average Polak to comprehend that slightly older children might want media that's a little edgier and more surreal than Caillou, and that something like the Powerpuff Girls might fulfill that niche. And even then I remember my mom loudly proclaiming her dislike for Powerpuff Girls, or especially Ed, Edd n Eddy, which was particularly hard to stomach as it was my very favorite show on Cartoon Network. The point I'm trying to make is that the Powerpuff Girls might be different from a conception of a show for toddlers, but not incomprehensible for most people. However, something like Naruto or Dragon Ball is such a radical challenge for a parent's perception of children's media that they automatically assume that there's something inherently wrong or immoral with a show like that. A show for little kids? Believable. A show for mischievous 10-year-olds? Comprehensible. An animated show for teenagers/young adults that features physical violence, sexual themes, romantic subplots, death on screen, super stylized animation that you can barely comprehend, and is from a foreign country that once cooperated with the Nazis? And is being watched by your preteen son? Absolutely unacceptable. Combine this with how most mainstream media tends to discuss anime, manga, and Japanese culture in general. If you've never had the displeasure of reading a Polish newspaper discussing the values contained within a manga, allow me to give you an example. I recall being about 15 and really into anime at the time. My grandma asked me to buy her a newspaper, which I did of course, and I decided to read some for myself. One of the smaller articles had a headline that said something along the lines of "Japan promotes child incest." Reading deeper into the article, I realized that it was referring to a manga that was premiering in Japan that apparently included strong themes of incest and underage intercourse. Yes, after the fact, I tried looking this article up on the internet and realized that my memory wasn't failing me altogether, as the article in question was from a newspaper my grandma notoriously praised. Here's an excerpt from the article. Tokyo lawmakers have removed a comic book describing incestuous relationships from stores where it could be accessed by children. It's the first manga that has been subject to prohibition of publishing media for minors portraying unlawful sexual acts, which has existed in Japan since 2011. The headquarters of Tokyo argue that removing a comic book, Little Sister's Paradise 2, inspired by an adults-only computer game of the same title, off the market, is done with the good of minors in mind. The graphic novel contains materials of incestuous nature. Japan's specific culture is often criticized for its approach to sexuality. Possession of child pornography is not illegal in that country, even though its manufacture and distribution can land you in jail. Despite that, the porn industry is very developed. Tourists visiting Japan are often surprised by the countless illustrations of underage girls in schoolgirl uniforms characterized by strong, considering the age group, sex appeal. It is also not uncommon to see adults reading pornography in public venues or on public transport. This might seem bad to an unaware reader, but even at the time I had enough context for the nature of erotic manga to understand that this is an attempt at causing a scandal based on the wrong assumptions. It starts correctly, mentioning that there's something seriously wrong with the manga in question, even by porn addict standards, but then it assumes that this is the case for Japanese culture as a whole, and that it is common practice for children to purchase those materials. I cannot deny the claims about the perversion of Japanese society, but it would be hard to convince me that a newsagent stand sells pornographic manga to any kid that asks nicely. And claiming that these works are meant to be sold to children is plausible considering the nature of the porn industry, but it's still a hard sell. Now here's the part where it becomes your problem. If this article was to catch a reader's attention, it might lead them to a poorly executed investigation on the internet. If you Google manga on your computer, the results might be bad enough. However, if you Google manga and pornography within the same sentence, the results will not leave much to your imagination. Next thing you know, your parents or grandparents will be increasingly suspicious about your reading habits, skeptical about the value of whatever it is you're watching on Kiss Anime or any related website, and they themselves have no contact with anime in general to counteract all the bad things they hear. All this combines to create a rather distorted image of what manga is as a whole, and when combined with a certain expectations an Eastern European parent has for the media consumed by their children, especially comic books or animation, this paints a very distorted image of the medium as something that is meant to be innocent entertainment for children becoming tainted by evildoers. I will not deny that there is a huge market for animated porn. I will not deny that Japanese society has a problem with perversion. I will, however, make the claim that the way these issues are presented does not help young consumers of non-offending manga and anime who might be caught in the crossfire of controversies and moral panic, similar to how video games and heavy metal tend to be blamed for school shootings. And the more you try to deny it, the more your moral guardians will question, "What is it about those weird evil books that makes my children so attracted to them?" Despite declaring myself a weeb for most of my early teenage years, I was often prohibited by my parents from watching any anime, as they described it, Chinese cartoons. If this wording just made you a little angry, it is probably for the right reasons. My parents always had a very skeptical attitude towards anime, most likely because it collided with their perception of what children's media ought to be. Pokemon? Not in this house. Naruto? You better not. Any American or Canadian cartoon that is remotely influenced by anime? That's out. Eventually they had to cave in when I turned 12 and started exploring new kinds of media by myself through the internet, as well as being influenced by my friends. My older sister had it far worse than me, never being allowed in contact with anime. Imagine being the only kid in your class who doesn't know anything about Pokemon because you're simply not allowed to. Gives you an idea of how innocent they wanted me to be. Years after the fact, this amounts to very little more than anecdotes of my parents being weird, but for the sake of this topic, it is an important example of how parents and guardians reacted to anime. And if this wasn't motivated by some kind of specific fear-mongering like some satanic panic of Pokemon, this was simply a cultural attitude resulting from the development of a medium before the internet. I know that I keep droning on this, but the long-term importance of it cannot be understated. To this day, watching anime or reading manga is often stigmatized in Polish society. Not to insinuate that you will be assaulted on the streets for wearing a Dragon Ball t-shirt, but children are likely to be laughed at for reading manga or mentioning their interests to others. And if a household is particularly keen on hating anime, the kids might grow to be especially spiteful to those who have access to the forbidden fruit. This has the potential to push a person in a few directions. One might decide to leave anime behind them altogether and never look back. One might resort to consuming it in secret, making it a guilty pleasure for themselves. But the worst that can happen is when someone becomes even more radical and stalwart in their love for a manga or anime, and they go full weeaboo. And while I probably don't have to describe the negative social effects of choosing to identify as that so strongly, there is still one factor that leads to growing resentment for Japanese media. And that is the otaku subculture in Poland. Hey, are you still here? Okay, listen up, this is kind of important. As some of you might be aware, my computer decided to have a stroke spontaneously as I was finishing up this part of the video, and my entire hard drive got corrupted. Throughout the last few months, I have been struggling with recovering my data. All hope seemed lost until I reached out for the help of the Nerd Rangers of Naperville. This is not an ad, I'm just putting it up here so you guys know that Nerd Rangers of Naperville are skilled specialists who get the job done, and they certainly are great people, and they deserve a gorillion followers and customers, and they certainly do have sex. So once again, big thanks to Nerd Rangers of Naperville, and see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.